and it's lovely to see all those names. Some of them are a little, there's a Daniel, for example. I can only guess at the last name. There's a last name, but it's good to see the familiar names. I wish I could see all your faces, but most of you are not putting on your video. But I understand that. I do the same thing. So let me just get the slide on, and the right slide. There we go. And then I'll start talking. Good. So I'm gonna make it the presentation so it's a big screen. So the title of this, From Tragedy to Nation, it subsumes, it brings in a lot of things that I muse about, most of which I'm by no means experts on. And when I think of some of the people, in fact, many of the people whom Ramaz has graduated, many of you have gone on to areas of expertise that put me to shame. So I'm looking forward to hearing you contest, debate, question, assert, whatever. I'm ready to do a lot of speaking, but by all means, I think you have the power and freedom to unmute yourself at will, and you should feel free to do so. So I start with the Victoria Monument in London. It's not a Jewish monument. It's a monument which is an expression of pride and power regarding the British Empire. And I want you to keep that thought in mind: pride and power, British Empire. And in fact, that's just part of a pattern which long existed as far as imagined communities of nationhood, imagined communities of empire. There's a picture here of an ancient Assyrian monument which depicts victory in battle, heroic victory in battle, enemies slaughtered. A famous Egyptian stele which celebrates once again victory of their empire, slaughter of enemies, defeat of enemies, power, glory, victory. And of course, the Victoria Memorial monument is just one aspect of that. So here's where we come to what I think of as being, and it's hardly my original thought, thank God, because it means that there must be some truth to it. What I regard as being one of the most amazing things that the Jewish people have bequeathed to the world, and that is a different way of thinking about communities and a different way of thinking about tragic experiences or experiences. And the genius of it is, as I see it, that most people, in fact, I can't think of any exceptions to this, in the ancient past, look to their gods and looks to their rulers for power and protection and pride. And when the Jewish people experienced tragedy, calamity, with the destruction of the first temple and exile, if they were normal like every other people, one would have expected that they would have abandoned their God, abandoned their identity, and disappeared from history. But instead, what happened was a reassertion of faith in their God, in the power of their God, in the uniqueness of their God. And of course, these lines are just expressions of that, that instead of thinking that their God was nothing, weak, meaningless, their God was all powerful. The covenant between the Jews and their God still remained. And in this case, it wasn't their God who had failed them, but they who had failed their God. And that was a unique way of thinking about their community and a unique way of thinking about their God. Something which, as I said, I cannot think of, even though I'm hardly a scholar of ancient history, I cannot think of any other example of a people who responded in that way. The prophets provided that response. And Tisha B'Av, of course, is the essence of that. It reasserts the centrality of Jerusalem. It reasserts the centrality of an obligation to God. It reasserts the hope that there will be a redemption as long as the Jewish people continue to abide by the covenant. And Tisha B'Av is noted, and I want, again, to keep this in mind in terms of how it's commemorated, how it's observed. And much of Jewish observance regarding these calamities is, of course, about memory, where we have to remember this awful event rather than earlier empires which wanted to remember only the glorious events. It's insistence upon the absence of something. There are rituals and customs of incompleteness. We are obligated not to feel any joy. I double checked, for example, a moment before whether there would even be a possibility of playing a snippet of mournful music, but no music even. There's discomfort and there are restrictions that are obligated. So that's a very, very different way of maintaining a community, and it provided enormous power. It was, to use a very, very modern and popular word, one of the most successful means to have ever appeared among people, because the Jewish community managed to survive the exile. It managed to survive all the calamities which are commemorated on Tisha B'Av, and it still remains a community when so many other communities, so many other nations and people have disappeared. And of course, shame is part of Tisha B'Av as well, a particular kind of shame. And I'm just quoting one particular passage that you're all familiar with. And that too is at odds with the earlier ways in which people were brought together as communities, which was to experience pride and glory. Not to say that there isn't any pride and glory in being Jewish after the destruction, but there is this additional element of shame. Shame in our own failings, shame in our own inability to measure up. So now I'm going to come to something which is very closely connected, understandably, to Tisha B'Av and to shame and to calamity. And that's the Holocaust and the arguments, the debates that took place over what was the way in which we should memorialize, commemorate, remember the Holocaust. And in fact, if you look at the date, December the 2nd, 1942, the initial responses coming to terms with, or trying to come to terms with, how are we supposed to confront this awful event, occurred while the Holocaust was still taking place. In fact, in December 2nd, 1942, I think I'd have to, Jeffrey, you would probably know this by heart. I think more than 50% of the Jews who were going to die, be murdered, had already been murdered by December 42. But there was still many years of suffering and murdering that still remained. But in Israel, discussions began to take place, and the chief rabbi, Herzog, decided or wanted to have a fast day. And the fast day he posed was on December the 2nd. And he approached the recently arrived refugee, Rav Soloveitchik, to ask him for his own go-ahead approval of a fast day on December the 2nd. And again, most of you are probably familiar with this, but Rav Soloveitchik was opposed to it. And he cited this line in particular, that one may not add any time of commemoration, that Tisha B'Av is the time of commemoration of tragedy and destruction, and there's no further one that may be added. And even though this does not have the authority of a legal requirement, it became essentially a widespread position. And it's based, I want you to notice, because I've had this discussion with some people recently about this, there's a widespread attitude that the opposition to creating a special day of commemoration for the Holocaust was because the Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox community was opposed to the secular state of Israel, or opposed to taking commands from the secular state of Israel. But notice there's absolutely nothing here which the secular state didn't even exist. Whether or not Rav Soloveitchik thought it was on the verge of existing is not relevant to his opinion. He's simply citing this idea that Tisha B'Av may not be, there may be nothing added to in addition to Tisha B'Av. And even as late as 1982, when Rav Feinstein wrote about this, I think it was in response, he wrote a letter to somebody in response to a question about it. And long after Yom HaShoah had been established, he gives similar reasons, and there's no mention of the state of Israel. So it has nothing to do, or not exclusively anything to do, with the impending or existing secular state. But it does show that there's now this contest taking place about what's the proper response to national tragedy, what's the proper response to a calamity. And Tisha B'Av, in the eyes of the Orthodox community, remained the exclusive day on which all these tragedies should be commemorated. In 1951, Yom HaShoah was proposed, the controversy continued, and it was ultimately enacted in 1959 as a day of commemoration. The specific day that's chosen, once again, there's a widespread misapprehension that it actually is the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. There is a connection about the choosing of the day to the Warsaw Uprising, but it also, there's a compromise in principle that it has to come after the end of Pesach. So this was the compromise day that was agreed upon. Once again, there were objections in the religious community, the ultra-Orthodox community in particular, about the enactment of this day. And even though among the numerous objections that were raised was that the secular state should not be making these kinds of rulings, the ones that, there were many other reasons. And I thought that these two were particularly interesting ones because they both raise theological issues, very clear theological issues. The first one is the non-uniqueness. It would, if there was a special day for commemorating the Holocaust, religious figures were concerned that by giving the Holocaust a special day, it takes it outside of history. And there was a concern that it might very well lead to questionings of religious values, religious belief. These people were convinced that the Holocaust should be thought of as part of an ongoing history, an ongoing relationship between God and the Jewish people, not as something that was outside of history, which might suggest in the eyes of some theologians that the covenant had been broken. The second reason that I found interesting was that the form of the commemoration that it takes, the sirens going off, as you see here, the picture with the sirens going off of people standing at attention, in the eyes of numerous rabbinic authorities, was an example of an imitation of the Gentiles, that these are the ways in which profane nations commemorated things and memorialized things, and it wasn't something that should be done by Jews. It might even take the form of a kind of idolatry. So these objections continued. The argument over how to confront tragedy, how a community that remembers tragedy should think about those tragedies, continued to provoke sharp debates. And I'm actually going to skip over, by and large, the Eichmann trial, because even though it plays a major role, I want to focus on the memorialization of the Holocaust, the commemoration of the Holocaust at this moment. But after the Eichmann trial, and in the 1970s, there were further reasons for it. I'm not going to go into the history behind it, although a particularly awful American TV show starring Meryl Streep played some role in that. Holocaust memorialization began to proliferate. And of course, Yad Vashem was built in Israel, but Yad Vashem has now become just one, maybe the most prominent, maybe the center, but one of many, many museums in the Galut. I almost feel like playing a multiple choice game with you, matching the museums, but some of them would be obvious from the picture. So we have the, you know, there's the American Museum, there's the London Memorial, there's the French Museum. I don't think I have the one from New York up here. There's the Canadian Museum, one in Indiana. Museums all over the place. We have at least a few Holocaust commemoration sites and museums out here on Long Island. And this raises a very, very interesting contest, tension, in terms of the arguments. We have the argument about should the Holocaust be commemorated on Tisha B'Av or on a special day. But then for those who say there should be special commemorations of the Holocaust, I want you to see how even there are contests and controversies and disagreements and differences. So one thing, and I'm still working this through in my mind of how to think about it, is earlier I spoke about Tisha B'Av as talking about emptiness, or thinking about the destruction of the first and second temples, as we're supposed to be reminded of what's missing in our lives, as what's not there, incompleteness that's going to remain until the Messianic age, perhaps. Isn't it so different from the way in which the Holocaust is commemorated, in which we have these concrete memorials that are put up, and we have this collection of objects? So there's a very, very different quality to Holocaust commemoration, aside from the fact that the commemoration takes place separately from Tisha B'Av. There's a very, very separate aspect to it in terms of the way in which it's commemorated, by the presence of things, by going, well, of course, one goes to the Western Wall, as in, one might compare that to going to sites, destroyed sites of former concentration and extermination camps. But these museums are something different. Aside from the difference in terms of emptiness versus presence, what's also remarkable in terms of the tension, in terms of Holocaust commemoration, is the fact that you have these sites, these museums in certain places. So there's an argument, of course, to be made, a good solid argument for why there should be a center in Berlin with its library and research center as well. The sites of the extermination and the murders, again, it's perfectly clear why those commemorative sites would be there. But it strikes me, it has always struck me as being odd that we should have these museums and these commemorations in Washington, D.C., in New York City, in Illinois, in other places. What is actually being expressed there? What type of community is being built or reaffirmed in these spots? I know I have my own opinions about that, which I'm about to tell you. So for example, I think that a place like the Washington Holocaust Center is connected, the building of it there, the placement of it there, is I think connected to a different kind of community building, and not necessarily the Jewish community, but the American community. And it's example not of remembering tragedy only, but I think there's an assertion in putting the museum in Washington, D.C. of also forgetting, because I find it odd that there should be a Holocaust Center in Washington, D.C. when we still don't, and this is going to sound very, very contemporary, and Jeffrey, you're free to start yelling at me, when we still don't have a national center about slavery. The Holocaust Museum in Washington seems more to me sometimes about reaffirming sometimes a delusional or illusory message that Washington, that United States is somehow responsible for reestablishing and the world, for making the world whole again, when it's got its own national tragedies and calamities that maybe should be remembered first. Another aspect of the museums which I find odd is, in terms of tension, is the museum, let me get the next slide on for this. The museum, the center in Israel, its message is very clear. And of course, many a foreign leader has been brought to the center and been shown the exhibits, and the message has been hammered home to them. And it's expressed most vividly by the exit to the museum, where after walking through the exhibit about national catastrophe, Jewish calamity, you come out and you see this vista of the hills of Jerusalem. There's, by the way, the presence of Jerusalem, kind of another comparison to Tisha B'Av. The hills of Jerusalem and the new Jewish state. And the message there is that, of course, the new Jewish state, this is part of what came out of the Eichmann trial, and it's part of what's intrinsic to the commemoration of Yom HaShoah, is we're not commemorating the Holocaust in terms of victimhood. We're trying to remember the redemptive part of it, the resistance that Jews had, the comparison to the Jews who, as it used to be spoken about, who went like sheep to their slaughter, versus the Jews who resisted and who helped to create, who did create this new Jewish state. That's the central message of the museum in Israel. The Galut museums express very, very different messages. And of course, there's a mixture. I'm not saying this is absolute in either case. Many of them have as central features temporary or permanent exhibits about genocide in general, about toleration of others. It's not just about the Jewish people. So these Holocaust museums are not really that much about then trying to perpetuate the community of Jews. They seem to be in many cases about other things. Another tension that I think is fascinating is, whereas the Israeli center is a center that drives home the message that Israel is necessary for the survival of the Jewish people, and every Jew really ought to go to Israel and settle in Israel. The presence of the Holocaust exhibits, the Holocaust commemorations and museums in the Galut, I think are sending the opposite message, that there is a real living possibility of life for Jews outside of Israel, that vibrant Jewish communities can be maintained outside of Israel. So here we have like contested space in terms of commemoration, memory of calamity, in terms of the Holocaust, multiple ways. And that gets to my finishing points, which is to make the clear connection between this Jewish gift to the world about suffering and how our community is to some extent, our nation is to some extent maintained and perpetuated because we remember our calamities, our suffering, side by side with the glorious moments as well. And we commemorate our suffering. And I think that that's played a central role, but I'm going to give a nuanced opinion about this, I hope, in terms of the shift that's taken place from nationhood as something which was based upon simple pride and glory in one's greatness compared to others, to nationhood that's based upon memories of being a victim. And that the cult of victimhood, the culture of victimhood, which so many people read about, talk about, write about, enact, the cult of victimhood comes from what I see as being a kind of distortion of what the Jews gave to the world, this unique notion that it's not power over others, but failure towards God that is the core of our nationhood, or the core of partly of our survival. But nowadays, victimhood is everywhere. And I'm going to, show you a few examples of this. This is Bristol, England, where we had the statue of a slave owner ripped down recently, and this statue of a African, what do we call them? British African? We have African Americans, but a British woman of Caribbean descent who was a demonstrator, and here she is not as a victim entirely, but certainly as somebody who is manifesting power after what presumably was years of not having any power at all. We've had the proposal that was recently made by a descendant of Thomas Jefferson, that Thomas Jefferson's memorial monument should be taken down, and that Harriet Tubman, a marginal figure in American history, should be commemorated instead. American identity as victimhood rather than American identity as authorship of the Declaration of Independence. Very, very different nature of national identity that's being proposed here. One of the things I've noticed over I almost actually said centuries, but decades of teaching, is when students have been given a chance to choose their own paper topics, propose their own paper topics, if we don't give them a list of things, we've begun doing that years ago, but there was a point when we didn't do that. And even when we do give these lists, invariably, I get loads of students, and so do my colleagues, who say, I want to talk about the Japanese internment. I want to write about the Japanese internment. I want to write about the Indian Trail of Tears. I want to write about America dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and how that was a crime. They already have their thesis before they wrote the paper. And I find it interesting that modern education and modern culture seems to have produced, even among young people who are still in their teens, a amnesia about anything that is heroic, prideful, and joyful to write about in American history. Or maybe they remember those things, but they're not interested in it. They want to write about things which are shameful. So we come back to shame again. But it's a very, very different kind of shame. I started with shame at failing God, but the shame of victimhood and commemorating of tragedy nowadays is not the shame of one's own failure. It's the shame of what others should be feeling for what they've done to you. And so what we've had now over the centuries is a transformation of many, many things which are core to Jewish identity and core to Jewish practices, which have been transformed over time and over space and over people into a kind of distorted version of memory, a distorted version of how to think about national catastrophe, national calamity, and a very, very distorted version about shame. And I think I'm making it clear by the way I'm speaking about it. It's not really one which I think is healthy. It's not one that I think is conducive to community building. And yet here we are, and we're stuck with it. Now, I gave myself time. I have a lot more things I could say, but I'm ending the formal presentation here because knowing many of you people, I wanted to give you a chance to speak up, make your own point, or ask me questions or contest something that I've said, especially if I see somebody like a Jonathan Krasner there. Anybody want to ask anything? I'm going to look at the chat. I'm going to get this off now.
I think you're going to be canceled after what you've said. You're going to have to join me in. You're going to have to join me in exile in Mississippi. I think you're done. I think all the millennials who just heard this are going to cancel you. You're finished.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I'm sure you actually approve of being in the same community as me in this particular case.
Yeah, very much so. Yes. The only thing I disagree with you about are the museums in the Galut. I mean, in my opinion, they were aider and abettors in the Holocaust. The reason we have Israel, if for no other reason, is that's a down payment on all the blood that we lost, that they caused. And I think there should be a Holocaust museum in every city because, you know, it's what they did to us. It's God forbid they should be let off the hook. We just have it in Israel, then it's just like this thing somewhere else has nothing to do with them. I want all of them to march through the museums and look what they did. So I disagree with you on that.
Well,
Other than that, I agree with everything else you said.
All right, Jeffrey, that might be lovely, but that's not what people are feeling when they go through the Holocaust Museum.
I don't think that's true, John. I think that the Jews don't feel that. I mean, Jews feel one of two things in my estimation. They either feel victimhood, which is what it is, or they think it's some weird thing that has nothing to do with them, which if you talk to my two children, my two older kids, that's how they feel. God help them. I think the Gentiles, for a second, when they go in there, do feel that. I think they feel, you know, what did our ancestors do? How could we allow this to happen? I do think there's that feeling. Does that feeling last after they leave? No, but it's something to remind them. And it's something, and forgetting everything else, you can argue, you know, is there a God? Did God promise this to us? Were there Jews in Israel before? Were there not Jews in Israel? All that stuff is disputable. The one thing that's not disputable is they could have gotten the Jews out. They didn't do it. They could have bombed Auschwitz. They didn't do it. They didn't do it because some of them just didn't give a shit, and others actually liked that what was happening. So this is an obligation that they have to us. I mean, do they have an obligation higher to us than other people? I mean, that's also arguable. But you know what? Show me anything in history where 6 million people were murdered like this, and the rest of the world actually could have done something and they didn't do it. I think this is a distinct crime. I think there's joint and several liability. And so I think they should be reminded.
Okay. I see some other things here. I just want to make a quick response to that. The Dutch historian, Dutch-British Jewish historian, Ian Baruma has written, and you know that I've spoken about this with you.
Yes.
One of the responses to Holocaust commemoration and the proliferation of these places is, of course, something which I've described as Holocaust envy, which is that other people resent the Jewish Holocaust because I think they secretly recognize that we actually did experience a unique suffering. So I'm not sure it promotes toleration and guilt.
I'm not saying it promotes
let me just hold
toleration.
on. I want to note, yes, Daniel Altman. You revealed yourself to me as Daniel Altman, and it's good to see you, so to speak. Right, that comes from Rav Soloveitchik was quoting Kinot 25, written following the First Crusades massacres. Right. And I'm going to just read your comment. They viewed that as a horrible massacre. However, we cannot add a new day. I think, you know, one of the arguments is this question of we cannot or should not. I mean, it depends on the translation, but it's not we must not. So there was some controversy, some question about whether or not this obligated us not to add a new day. Leah, you've noted some wonderful stuff on commemoration. Yeah, I'm familiar with James Young. Okay, Jonathan Krasner to everyone. To be fair, why should an American public school devote an entire semester to Holocaust education if it doesn't have a larger civic message? Good, Jonathan, you want to unmute yourself and?
I am unmuted.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
No, I mean, I just, Leah Strigler rightly points out that if you look at Facing History's curriculum, you'll see that the overarching message of the curriculum is that people should be upstanders rather than bystanders. And while there has been a lot of criticism of Facing History for, you know, arguably de-emphasizing the particularistic Jewish angle to the Holocaust, I suppose that, you know, to play devil's advocate, one could say, well, given that this is an American, you know, we're talking about American schools and an American education. We're not talking about Jewish day schools right now. We're talking about American public schools. And given how little time is devoted to history in general, why wouldn't you want Holocaust education there to have a more universalistic slant rather than a particularistic one? If it has a particularistic slant, then what makes it different from any other tragedy that's befallen a group of American, you know, people? And this tragedy wasn't even a tragedy that occurred on American soil. So why would you devote so much time to it in a curriculum if it didn't have a larger message? Right,
and it's a right, meaning I understand what you're saying and possibly even agree with some of it. And it's a troublesome issue because so little time, as you said, in the public schools is devoted to history. The public schools are not Ramaz, where we devote a lot of time to history. My argument about why the Holocaust should be studied in public schools actually has little to do with the facing history, facing ourselves. I think that actually a thoughtful and appropriate and accurate history of World War II and of Nazism would be not only incomplete, but completely off base if they didn't actually teach about the Holocaust. Whether or not that's something which belongs in the public schools is a second question, but it is an issue of good history. You know, when I first started teaching at Ramaz, what's that?
You've just subtly changed the terms of the discussion, whereas I was saying that you would have a hard time convincing a public school to spend an entire semester on the Holocaust. Now you've suddenly changed it to, well, maybe, you know, should they teach the Holocaust at all? Well, of course they should teach the Holocaust. But the question is, if you're only spending a week on World War II altogether, you know, how much of that time should be on the Holocaust?
Probably about half of it.
So that's 2.5 days.
Dr. Jucovy, I have a sort of oblique question to that. First of all,
Jonathan.
It's been far too long. So, you know, even though there's no joy to be felt on this day, it's still, you know, it's still great to see you. So one of the things that I've noticed as maybe one of the younger alumni in this chat is that there's a trend among American Jews in particular of nostalgia now for Yiddish and shtetl culture and the European aspects of our heritage that I see much more among my American friends than among my Israeli friends. And I wonder if you think that Holocaust education in America focusing on toleration as opposed to Holocaust education in Israel focusing much more on Zionism has anything to do with that, and maybe where you see it going if you see that in high school kids who I'm somewhat less in touch with now.
Right. Well, I'm not going to see, at least I have not seen that with our Ramaz students, because our Ramaz students are a special demographic in terms of American Jewry. I think that what you noted is true. I think your reasons that you noted are also accurate. I would add one other nuance to it, and it dates back to the 1970s. I'm going to tell you a little anecdote, which Jonathan Krasner may have witnessed me make. No, maybe not, because it depends on the particular Facebook community that I make my obnoxious remarks to. But there was a meme going around which went along the lines of, you know, among right-thinking people, this was among my high school classmates. So a group of 70-year-olds who have all turned out wonderfully in terms of their decency. And the meme was, why are there African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, but white people don't have to be hyphenated? And everybody was cheering this one on, this meme on, about how unjust it was and how awful and degrading it is to be a hyphenated American. And I had to, as a historian, point out, and this is going to get to your point about the interest in the shtetl, the interest in Eastern Europe. In the 1970s, and there are a number of ways in which the things that caused this. There was a growing interest among many hyphenated Americans in their origin, in their roots. And in fact, the TV show Roots played an enormous role in that. And this cult of authenticity was that as just Americans, we had been robbed of our identity. We'd been kind of like, the melting pot notion was that we had been crushed together in this identityless mush, and we had to rediscover our identities. And so hyphenated American actually became a source of pride. It was the poor WASP, the ones who didn't get the hyphen, who had nothing to celebrate. You get a sense of this with that god-awful movie Titanic, where the true people, the good people, the real people are the ones down in steerage who know how to enjoy life, live life, whereas the WASPs up in the first class dining room are just these boring people. So, you know, things like Fiddler on the Roof and the Black Power movement, obviously the 1967 war, all these things, interestingly enough, in terms of the 1967 war, for some Jews, it actually contributed not to a growing religiosity, but to this other kind of identity seeking, which was a fascination with our ancestors in Eastern Europe. So I think that's part of it. I mean, educationally, I think that's, you know, what you noted is certainly taking place in Israel. And those of you who live in Israel really should tell me about this. But I would think that in Israel, the diaspora is still not taught about in very positive terms. So Jonathan, does that go at least partway to answering your question?
It does, and I also got a text from Alexander Rabinowitz, who, you know, we were in college together, so we both saw this a bit, saying that a lot of it has to do with the fact that many Jews who went through the sort of education that American Holocaust curricula are designed to impart are less comfortable with Zionism and particularism per se.
Right. And that, yeah, and that's still a sizable body of the Jewish community. I don't know whether it's growing or diminishing, but it's still a widespread opinion. And that's partly why these Holocaust museums and commemorations in the United States are really all about universalism and facing history or facing ourselves. It's universalism. Because the particularism is something that we shouldn't be emphasizing. I'm seeing Gabi. I'm trying to see that remark here. I'm curious what your thoughts are on the balance. Glorifying someone with a problematic past. Right. Interesting question. Gabi Agus is asking about, specifically, she appropriately mentions Woodrow Wilson. So, first of all, I have to say, it's not like I'm a big fan of memorials to begin with. And most of them have very, very little artistic value. But on the other hand, I'm also not somebody who is comfortable with what I regard as being a kind of Stalin-esque wiping out of memory. And so whether or not it's possible to actually parse this well in every single case, it all depends on what somebody is being celebrated for. So Woodrow Wilson, who, as you very, very well might remember, is somebody I have very little regard for. But Woodrow Wilson was an important president of Princeton. He was an important president of the United States in ways that it's not inappropriate for Americans to feel pride in. his role in reinstituting segregation are not the reasons why his name appears and commemorations appear for him. So to me, Gabi, the question of whether to remove or keep something to a large extent depends on what exactly is that thing commemorating. If the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. were commemorating Jefferson's relationship with his slave, or his maintaining of slavery, or his perpetuation of it and his promotion of it in this country, it would be an inappropriate thing to have in our national capital. But that's not why the monument's there. So that there are tougher calls than those two, I think. But and Robert E. Lee is not one of them. Leah, historic point. The argument was making reflects the reasoning that was used when Holocaust was being. Yeah.
Back to the curriculum point, but I also wanted to add something to Jonathan's question, Jonathan B, not Jonathan K, which is that there was a kind of churn in Holocaust education and programming that came out of a realization that there was a Holocaust fatigue. People were tired.
Right. Yeah.
And that's one piece of it. People were tired of Holocaust enough already. Not necessarily in a population like Ramaz, but bichlal. And then also there was a growing consciousness that as we moved away from that history, or younger generations were coming up, they were learning about the destruction, but not about what was destroyed.
Right.
So turn to look at what Eastern European Jewish life was like. And the relatively new museum in Poland is actually indicative of this, right? It tells the entire history of Polish Jewry, not just the destruction.
Right, which, and certainly, I was going to say one can, but I can find nothing objectionable about there being a museum about Polish Jewish history, which was a major part of Polish history. And to kind of echo Jeffrey Islander, the Poles ought to be reminded of that, among others. I am, by the way, uncomfortable, though, with this notion of required Holocaust education that these states are having. It does seem to, I think things like that are going to actually promote anti-Semitic feeling rather than fight against it. You know, why are we getting this special treatment? And it's also something that educators should be deciding, not state legislatures. So, Jonathan, how is the tendency of young people to blame their elders with an almost... Jonathan, Jonathan asked, how is is that you laughing in the background? How is the tendency of young people today to blame their elders with an almost blind, puritanic zeal and different, any different, you meant, from your generation in the 1960s? John, any difference, I'm assuming you wanted to finish with? Jonathan Krasner's always trying to accuse me of being a baby boomer, but I am, right? First of all, I'm not sure that there was a blind puritanic zeal to blaming elders. I mean, there were those who did that, but you'll always find that in every generation to some extent, at least in recent times. I'm not sure it was true generations ago. So that's just simply something which comes with the present state of human nature. It's a silly response, isn't it? You know, Jonathan, where are you? Are you visible? I want to see your face.
Yes.
I'm here. I'm here.
You're here. Okay, so hold on a moment. I want to get to the right screen. There you are, Jonathan. I think you know, Jonathan, that I never blame the older generation for anything. That's, by the way, an honest thing. It's just simply a stupid way of thinking about life.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm not, I bear no responsibility for the idiocy of others. Do we have any other people here who want to, we've gone overtime. That's wonderful.
Dr. Jucovy, you can go as long as you'd like, and then we're going to open it up for everyone to chat with you, because that's, I think, going to be 3/4 of the fun. This has been really amazing and interesting and a wonderful way for us to end our day of commemoration and of thinking about all of the Jewish tragedies and a lot of good conversation. We're now going to open it up for all alumni and friends to talk to one another and specifically to Dr. Jucovy.